If walls could talk, what would they say? But they have been here many days, but they have no tongue with which to speak, but they have point out God's ways to see. The wall that formed Rahab's house could speak of her great faith, with a scarlet portion let down to spines and sent them safely away. Yes, the walls could talk, what wouldn't they say? For they have been here many days, but they have no tongue which to speak, but they have point out God's ways to see. Jericho's walls could testify the faith's obedience. When they heard the trumpet sound, with a shout, they tumbled down at once. Yes, what would they say? For they have been here many days, but they have no tongue which to speak, to help point out God's ways to see. Jerusalem's walls fell down by war, when Nehemiah bore the king's cup. He encouraged folks to have a mind to work, and the walls were built back up. Yes, the walls could talk, what wouldn't they say? For they have been here many days, but they have no tongue which to speak, but they have point out God's ways to see.
In addition to the outline that we have online, I've printed up a chart here that I thought at the first of the lesson to give you a concept where you can see where Nehemiah is going to be building as he rebuilds these walls. It didn't say necessarily built new ones. He rebuilt the walls that had crumbled. Some 35 times in the book of Nehemiah we'll see the idea of rebuilding. And so Hezekiah's wall, which will be on the east side, that's the only place they could put that, it's not build a new one, but restoring walls that they had. I think Hezekiah's particular wall was more of a sloped wall, but they repaired that. And I wanted just to see, as we look at two parts of this book, and then we'll get to the outline itself, where I think this might help us to understand what is taking place. But in Nehemiah, Old Testament book, Nehemiah, when he comes to Jerusalem, pick up with me in Nehemiah, the 2nd chapter, and you tell me as you look at this, what part of the city is he looking at? When he came by night, hadn't told him what his plans were, apparently had some men with him, but he goes by night. I went out by night by which gate? So which gate did he go by? What does your Bible say? Mine says Valley Gate. Is that you there with me? Nehemiah 2:13. I went out by night, and by the Valley Gate, even toward the Jackal's Well, and to the Dung Gate. And he says toward and viewed the walls of the Jericho. So we see Valley Gate and Dung Gate. Which part of the city, north, south, east, or west, are we located that he went to see? Went to the south. And notice how he turns the corner. When he viewed Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire, then I went to the fountain gate and to the king's pool. What might be the king's pool in this chart? What might it be? The pool of Siloam. It's in that particular area. And there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass because of the rubble and so forth. So I went up the night by the brook. So which brook is he talking about? Remember this Gihon Spring? You got the Kidron Valley. And so he went up by that brook, the Kidron Valley, and there's a brook that runs on that east side of the city. And from that point of view, he could get a whole panoramic view of the eastern wall. We got the southern wall he's looking at. He's passed through these areas, but he goes to the Kidron River, brook, which becomes a river sometime, and he can look up and see all of the eastern walls, Horse Gate, all that area, from the Fountain Gate all the way up. He could see what condition that was in. And then he retraces his steps, and he goes back to the Valley Gate. You get a picture of that? He's looked at the south, he's looked at the east, and now he has an idea what's in store for him. So we come to chapter 3, and verse 1, we read that Eliashib, the high priest, he rose with his brethren, the priests, and they builded the what gate? Look where the sheep gate is. Is it on the north side? So I've looked at the south, he's looked at that, he's looked at the east. Now, when they start building, he's going to be building the sheep gate. And that's where, of course, the sheep would come in to the, and notice what is connected. He sanctified it, set up the doors of it, even under the tower of Hamiah. We don't have that on here, but you have the tower of Hanabal and Hananel, and that's probably where that tower was, near the sheep gate, because you're looking at that. And so what happens in verse 3, and what gate starts working on? The fish gate. So we've gone south, we've looked at the east, we're now taking care of the north wall. And that's the areas that start to get taken care of. Verse 6 says, the old gate repaired. Joy, that old gate was probably on that part of the northern part near, connected with the old city. Notice where the temple area is. It says here the temple area, kind of adjacent across from the horse gate. That's the gate where the horses would come through. That in that particular central area there would be the old gate that came through. And I won't just belabor the point, but I think we get a picture of where everything is. The Valley Gate, verse 13, was repaired. The Dung Gate, verse 14, is repaired. The Fountain Gate, verse 15, is repaired. And that's what he had been looking at. So you have that north, you have the east, you have the south, areas where they needed to repair the walls. And that's what they set out to do. And I just thought that would be just a picture of what you're looking at. Now, what I wanted to see is that while we're looking at these details, because we won't get that detailed in our study, but notice in verse 5 of chapter 3, there's something that is distinguished from what happens in the other areas of the work. He says, and then the Tekoites repaired, but their nobles put not their necks to do the work of their Lord. What does that mean? Put that in modern terms. Who didn't do the work? They got a lot of chiefs, not enough Indians. But they have plenty of Indians. Because that is a statement of fact. And I think it's there because, we look at Nehemiah, he's prayed to God, he's got all the things. It's like there's no problems. And we know there's going to be conflict from sources that are people in the area that don't like Israel. But here is an area of Tekoa. This is where the wise women came from. In the days of David, Absalom, giving him wisdom how he should treat Absalom. And it was a little village. And it says their workers did not work, but their rulers didn't. Their people who are, their nobles didn't, but the people did. And look what happened in verse 26. Now the Nephilim dwelt in Ophel. If you look this Triopian Valley, the central part of this city, that whole area, Ophel, is considered Ophel. It's kind of on a ridge. And it says, they dwelt there under the place over against the water gate. If you see there going toward the east, toward the water gate, and the tower that standeth out. After him, the Tekoites repaired another portion over against the great tower that standeth out under the wall of Ophel. And that's probably on that, that north those side, or at least on this, on the southeast side, this tower at this corner, Kidron Valley. So they were involved in working on the north part, but they worked so well, they got another portion, didn't they? So were they discouraged because their bosses wouldn't work with them or didn't want to work? No, they met the challenge. And it's interesting how God puts that particular detail in there, because the rest of the nobles, they're working with the different people. The priests are working. But here was this certain people that didn't do that. I think we're seeing that even among the workers and the people that were coming there to work, their nobles would not have a part in that. And there was enemies, there was conflict taking place. When we think about that northern wall, look what happens in Nehemiah, the 12th chapter, and verse 39. These are things we won't look at detail, but I want to bring out here. It says, and above the gate of Ephraim, and by the old gate, and by the fish gate, I know where that is, and the tower of Hananel, I know where that is, and the tower of Hamiath. So I think that north gate was on that side of the city unto the sheep gate. And they stood still in the gate of the guard. So you just go from left to right. These were where, in this context, I think the Levites are coming from the west, and they go from the fish gate to the tower of Hananel, the Hamhill, old gate, up to the sheep gate. That's kind of where they were headed. It's a real place. Real things happen. Things in order take place. And look how Jeremiah prophesied. Remember, Jeremiah, he speaks at a time when this city is going to be destroyed, and it will Babylonian captivity. But look what he says in chapter 31 and verse 38. Behold, the days come, saith Jehovah, that the city shall be built to Jehovah from the tower of Hananel unto the gate of the corner. I wonder what the gate of the corner is. You could go the fish gate, but probably the sheep gate. That north part of the wall is going to be rebuilt. And Jeremiah's prophesying, yes, it's going to be destroyed, and it's going to be rebuilt, and that's exactly what's happened in the days of Nehemiah. So I thought that you might have that in hand, because we'll see, we got a picture of Jerusalem, we got a picture of going to Babylonian captivity and coming back. And we got a picture of the first temple period, 1000 to 586 BC. What happened in 586 BC? Why this particular map would be important to us. That's when Nebuchadnezzar came in and burnt the city and destroyed that. So what you see here, and I want you to, and this is where our first question will help us need to understand. From what two perspectives was Jerusalem protected from her enemies? Let's look at that little chart from the first temple period in your outline. You see the dark areas. What are those called? You got the Valley of Hinnom in the south. You got the Kidron Valley on the east. See that Kidron, that river runs through. That's where he went to see that eastern wall. And then in the middle of Jerusalem, you had another valley. That's where this Ophel is, where the Nephites were dwelling. It's kind of a ridge. There's a valley in the middle as it connects to the Valley of Hinnom and the Kidron Valley below the city. Those are valleys. When you have a valley, Jerusalem is sitting up high. So from the topography, would that be something that would give them a protection from enemies? Would it be hard for them to be taken? When you have the city sitting up there, and from the east and the west and the south, they're going to have to come through a valley and up the valley walls to get to us. And then, so valleys is what I'm speaking about, but also they had a wall, and the wall surrounded them. There again what was that for? It was for protection. But what does God do? He brings the Babylonian Empire upon them. So, and they conquer them. Question number 2, why was Jerusalem invaded and destroyed? What's the purpose of God doing that to his people? What's that? They had turned from him. And so what did they turn to when they turned from him? That's like Jeremiah. Remember, Jeremiah is right at the time he prophesies about it. Jeremiah 2:13 is a great passage that sums it up. My people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, that's Erica's point, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, the fountain of living waters. He is the source of living waters. And hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns, that can not hold water. Where did they turn to? What were the cisterns that could hold no water? Idolatry. Promises a lot, but doesn't deliver. It's empty, vain idolatry. It causes us to be empty as well, because there's no reality about that other than our imaginations, and that falters in times of need. So, because they would not heed the prophets such as Jeremiah, then God he promised he would. He brought Nebuchadnezzar against them, and they besieged the city for a long time, and very difficult time, but then they destroy the city. They tear down the temple and burn the city. And so what's the next book after Jeremiah in our Bibles? What is that book called? Well, the next book to Jeremiah. Jeremiah, and it's Lamentations, isn't it? He lamented. He was lamenting because he lived through the destruction of Jerusalem, that Nehemiah is building up those walls again. He lived through that. And that is a marvelous book to realize here. It's sad because of what they're having to suffer, but he knows it won't be the end of the people. This is a discipline action. And so it brought the town. It wasn't, well, Nebuchadnezzar got too strong and he wanted to defeat the people. In his mind, he may have, but who had God prophesied it would come, and that's what he promised would happen, and so it occurred, and that's what we see taking place. Any questions on that? All right, let's notice. You have a little timeline on this. We might look at. I don't know if that would be helpful to you. Look on page 1. Here's just some time frames that we could see. After, we have Saul and David and Solomon. You have a divided kingdom in Israel. So there's 120 years of those 3 kings, and then the kingdom divides. We have a northern kingdom, and then the southern kingdom was comprised of Benjamin and Judah. Those are 2 tribes, so the 10 tribes of the north. What happened in 722? Israel, the northern kingdom, falls to what worldwide nation? Assyria. And many Israelites were taken captive, dispersed into other lands. 650 BC, Assyrian Empire is conquered by Babylon. Then 586 is our time frame that we're looking at. Solomon's temple and the city walls destroyed, left in piles of rubble. More Israelites are taken captive and dispersed in other lands. But what we'll see in Nehemiah gets word from a friend who is from Jerusalem. Not everybody was taken into captivity. They left the poor. They left a lot of the people there. They took the educated, the nobles, and that sort of thing into captivity. But they left people there. And the message comes from Jerusalem, from Nehemiah's friend to Nehemiah. How are things going in Jerusalem? What was the report? Not so good. Not so good. And we'll talk maybe some details about that. But then, 539 BC, the Babylonian Empire is conquered by Persia. So you have the Medo-Persian Empire, and the prominent one is Persia. King Cyrus allows some Israelites, led by Zerubbabel, to return to rebuild the temple, and that was completed in 516 BC. So they come back from captivity, and they first of all build the temple. The temple is built before the walls were built. But the temple, or rebuilt. But the temple was rebuilt. That had difficulty. They got where they want to take care of their own house instead of God's house, and you got Hezekiah and Zechariah, get the people working, but they finally did that. And then the prophet Ezra returns to Jerusalem in 458 BC, and we read that in Ezra 7 and 8, and then 444, 445 BC, Nehemiah's story begins. Now, what is interesting about prophecy, when Daniel's three friends, when they're supposed to bow before the great image of Nebuchadnezzar that he had in the field, and they didn't do that. And then there's the image that Nebuchadnezzar sees of this great image that had to do with him. He's the head of gold. And then you have all of these nations that had come not into being yet, or done what is prophesied about them, that are in being, but they're not as powerful to do what they're going to do. He prophesies that will happen. And then we read through the Bible what happened after we find the coming back from captivity. You find the Roman Empire coming into being and being a world empire, and God looks, and before that you have the Grecian Empire. Who was the leader of the Grecian Empire that we know of? Alexander the Great. God talked about Greece coming into power way before Greece came into power. And he prophesied these things would happen. We find it recorded, and it happened exactly like that. And after the Roman Empire has formed, God said, I will set up my kingdom in the days of those kings. What kingdom did he set up? That is a universal kingdom that will never be taken down, like Babylon, Assyria, Israelites, Greece, Rome. What kingdom did he set up? The church. And he set that spiritual kingdom which shall never be shaken in the days of those kings. All these world empires, it's interesting, we haven't had a world empire and like we have in those days, where if soldiers are in every place. America may look like that sometime, but not like they were here. And we fought wars and we got out in early days and helped people get back on their feet. But the world empire was dominating. Alexander the Great wanted to conquer the whole world, and he went out to do it. But it's interesting to me that since that time we haven't had that, but we've had the church being established in the days of the Roman Empire when God said so. And he said that will never be shaken or taken out of the way. Why? Because it's spiritual. Who's king of this spiritual kingdom? God and Jesus Christ sitting on his throne. It's his kingdom, the kingdom of the Son of my love, that has been established. It rules in the hearts of people, and it will never be destroyed. Now, our heart may get weak and we may fall away from him, but it will always be there. And at the end, 1 Corinthians 15, at the end, God will return his kingdom back to God. That rule, as spiritual rule, when he comes back and raises the dead, he will return that kingdom back to God, and God will be all in all, like he planned from eternity. All the time will be over with. But that kingdom is never shaken. That's why we want to encourage people to become a member of that kingdom, regardless of what nation you're from on earth. But it's interesting how these world empires come and they go, and nations come and they fall. But the church, Jesus says, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, hell, the Hadean world of death, will not conquer his church. Death won't conquer Jesus. He lives forever. And he won't conquer you. We'll live forever in heaven, or we'll be existing in hell, but we will, the idea of life and living eternal life, that's what God gives us when we become Christians. So all of the history of the world and the plan of God, it's not a contradiction. Who's in control? God. And we talk about we talked about Sunday night sermon. We talked about how we should bless the Lord because of his sovereignty. He rules. And when my world is crumbling, I know he's in charge. That's a wonderful truth to know. And that's what we find in God. And we're just seeing some plans work out the way God, and sadly, people fall into it because they didn't obey God. Question 3, when did Nehemiah live? So 445 BC. Now, what was his occupation before this Persian king, Artaxerxes I? Yeah, a cupbearer. Why would a king want a cupbearer? Yeah, and probably maybe to taste it, see if anybody wants to kill him. That might be something. But that's what Nehemiah did as he was there. But he was caring about Jerusalem. So how did Nehemiah ever get involved in building Jerusalem's walls? How did he know about this? We mentioned it a while ago, but let's look at some details. See, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Havaliah, now came to pass in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men out of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, that were left of captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captive, that are in the province, are in great affliction and what? And reproach. And we're going to see the enemy stand up, but what would be one thing, we know about affliction, difficulty, but why would they be feeling reproach? Is this the city of your God? Look at it. The walls are burnt, and they are broken down. Now, we have to make up our mind, are the walls from 586 to now 445, they've never been repaired? Or are these walls that crumbled, maybe some tried to build them back up, but they've been burnt again and disrepair again? That's why the reproach, you call this the people of God, and this was the city of God, and all these years nothing has happened. I could see them being under reproach. And Nehemiah came to solve that, because he was going to rebuild that wall. So what did he do? He came to pass when I heard these words that I did what? He sat down and he wept, and he mourned certain days. Now, we'll pick it up in a moment. Have you ever looked at how long between the time that he got the message, by the time he said, I'm going to do something about it? What are the two time marks? When did he find out about it? The month of Chislev. That's about the 9th month in the year. So we're looking at December, January, somewhere along there. But when he does something about it as a cupbearer, what month is it? Chapter 2 and verse 1. It's Nisan. That's the first day, that's the first month of the Jewish New Year. That's April. December to April. He didn't ask anything of the king. 4 months. Oh, 4 months. And that's just always, I mean, you're so sad by this. And it takes you 4 months to ask for help from the king. What might have kept him from it? It's my question I ask. And you kind of see from the part, is he afraid of looking sad before the king? You don't dare look sad for the king in your service of the king, especially the Persian king. And that was something you just do with their president, and there's the fear of that. It also could be, what could I do about it? I'd rather wait till springtime and summertime when the things are going to things will be completed. Back then, he may be waiting for that strategy. But it's interesting, there was 4 month delay between the time he sits down and cries before he does something about it. And a lot of it could be, here's my position, thinking through all that, or just thinking, hey, we're December, maybe springtime, and be a time to get on the ball with that. But it's just interesting. We don't told why, but the Bible said there was a delay in that. But what did he do? He mourned for certain days, and what did he do? In verse 4, I fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Does God command you today to fast? Is that a New Testament command? It's not. So we can't make laws where God doesn't make laws. So it's something that we do as an individual, but we see it happening in the Bible. And we see God's people doing that in the Bible. For example, when Paul and Silas are going to be sent forth in their missionary work, the first missionary journey that they're going to be involved with, we see here that in chapter 13, verse 3, Barnabas, I said Silas, verse 2 says, as they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Spirit said, separate me, Barnabas and Saul, for the work whereunto I called them. And when they had fasted and prayed, they laid their hands on them and sent them away. So here's the leaders of that church in Antioch. They laid hands on them. It wasn't to depart a mysterious, miraculous power, but it was to appoint them. We are authorizing you, go to that service. But what did they do before that, for sending them? They didn't just pray, did they? They fasted. So what do they fast from, you think? It's food. And that's what we see. So we see in the New Testament times, if you have a King James translation or a New King James, you'll see fasting added to this text in some translations. 1 Corinthians 7, here is the marriage relationship that he speaks about as Christians. And because of fornications being so prevalent in Corinth, because of their idolatry, they had priestesses who were prostitutes. And so you had that constant on the corners. You had that temptation. And so because of fornications, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband, and let the husband render unto the wife her due, talk about the sexual relationship, and likewise also the wife unto her husband. Wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise, husband hath not the power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud you by keeping sex from him, but defraud ye not one the other, except by consent for a season, that ye may give yourselves unto prayer. If you got the New King James, it's fasting and prayer. So Satan might not, but then you come back together again after that time frame, that Satan may tempt you not because of your lack of self-control. So that happens. We see it all through the New Testament. Now, there was a man that he said, I fast twice a week. And he was a self-righteous man, and he's not justified that day. So it wasn't the idea, well, I'll do a lot of it, and therefore God will bless me more. No, it doesn't work that way. Under the Jewish time, there was a fasting when they had the Days of Atonement. So there was sometimes of sadness when people would fast and pray, but sometimes like fast and pray before you go on a mission, fast and pray while you're keeping yourself sexually from your mate because you're doing what? What are the two things connected there? One's sex and one's going out here preaching the gospel. It's that in fasting, you're saying, God, you're more important to me than food. You're more important to me than sex. I want to focus my mind. We're going to be praying to you. We're going to be servants of you. We're going to focus our mind, keep ourselves from things that bring us joy, that are necessities for living. God, you're more to us than life at this moment. And that's where fasting comes in. And That's why New Testament people did that. That's why it could be recommended. There's times when you say, well, I'm going to study my Bible, I'm going to read that, and you can dedicate yourself. I'm not going to eat today. I'm going to fast. Well, what are you going to do in your 30-minute break? I'm going to pray. I'm going to talk to God. He's the most important thing to me. And I'm going to show myself that He's more important than anything. It's not to prove anything to Him, but it's to show myself. I want to have that type of self-control, that God is more important than my family, my job, or what have you. So every once in a while, that might not be a bad thing to do. That's what he does here. A lot of that is sorrow, but it's total dedication. That he is talking to God and praying. And I think that's where my point is, that can benefit us today. How does fasting and prayer work well together in our spiritual relationship with God? A lot of times when you're dedicating yourself in prayer, talking to God, studying His Word, that's a good time to do that. Any comments or questions you might have about that? But it's not demanded. It's not commanded. It's just interesting. But it's something that as we are disciplining ourselves, and we part of the fruit of the Spirit and things that we're to add to is the self-control. Those are areas that we have. And I want to prove to myself God's more important to me than anything. And sometimes that's a way of doing that. Question 6. From Nehemiah's prayers, what do you learn that helps you in your own prayers to God? We can't just study all the details of his prayers, but let's pick up on, I think there's a little box here that helps us kind of categorize what happens in his prayer to God. That first prayer to God, when he's speaking about his fasting and prayer, what do you see there? And if you look at the next page after the bottom of listing the prayer, look at that little box. Nehemiah's prayer included the following. There was an expression of reverence and faith toward God. Does his prayer start out there? I prayed, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, in this particular translation, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. Is that a way of starting out with honoring God, who God is? When Jesus taught us, when he taught the disciples how to pray, how did he start the prayer? Yes. Hallowed be thy name. We're honoring him. We're approaching God, who is, we have here in our term, awesome God. He's holy. He's separate from God, separate from man. And I'm man praying to you, God. We're not on equal terms, but there's honoring him. And so we see Nehemiah doing that. Jesus is teaching us to do that. But we also see that he wants God's attention, as if God didn't know what's going on. But ask and seek and knock. God wants us to ask specifically what we feel, what we need. Because that's an expression of prayer. God, if it's a good gift from me, I want that, because I think it'll be good. I prayed, I remember praying for people close to me that were on death. I prayed for their life. I just prayed for their life. And I gave God reasons in front of them why I want them to live. And I thought it's not being selfish, but at that moment when they're wanting to live and they're having a hard time facing death, I want them to live too, because they have a lot of good qualities to add to our life as a church and people like that. And being that specific, I think that's the way God wants to be talked to. And does he give them some extra days? Sometimes he says no. But specificity with God is what, and we see here what he wants. There's an expression of sorrow for the fathers and their own sins. They confess sin. He does that. He even said, we've done it. I've done it. All are involved. He recognizes the consequences of such actions. I will scatter you among the nations. God, I know you promised that would happen. We understand that. We also recognize the promise you'll bring the people back. And that's what, yes, Sarah?
Well,
I think that's so. Let's look at something else that goes with that too. When he does talk to the king, he said, "I took up the wine and gave it to the king, and I had been before time sad in his presence." And the king said, "Why is the countenance sad, seeing that thou art sick?" He knows he's not sick, but he has a sorrow of heart. "Then I was very sore afraid, and what did I do?" He said, I said unto the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad? But when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, flieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire." The king said unto me, "For what dost thou make request?" And what did he do? He prayed. He prayed again. And I think the point is, he's been praying and maybe hadn't got his answer yet. Is that your point? I think it's very much so. And wait on the Lord. But he had a little quick prayer here when the king's asking, "What do you want? What do you need?" What did he do? Talk to God. And right after that, he has a list, doesn't he? That goes to your point of why that time frame is there. And I think it's a great point. And I can see something happen like that here. Well, that's a good example that sometimes you can just have a quick prayer while you're driving down. Yeah, driving down the way. But he had a specific thing. The king just asked him a question, and it seemed like they're being the same setting. But he prayed to God and got an answer. And he delivers on that. That's a good point. What's that? Yeah, I think so. No, that's right. I think that's probably what happened. He wanted to know from God before I talked to him. But there was that. There's the terror of being sad before a king, you know, and so. But he is asking God's guidance through all this, and I think that's very important. Any other thoughts that you might have? From Nehemiah's prayers, what do you learn that helps you in your own prayers to God? There's one of them. I have silent prayer at times of I need to answer and things of that sort. Go.
I think the point you made earlier, that when you have personally asked for people to live at their bedside. I know me personally, a lot of times when we go to God over something serious in our life, sometimes we can feel selfish, or we have the thought, who am I to even ask God this? But we see that, I mean, he even expressed it, that, God is with his people. And we know that Old Testament and New Testament, that if we're living righteously, God wants us to come to him and ask us those questions, even when we feel little in his presence. And
That's right.
it shows us that we need to be more reliable and refocus our prayers when we do feel that way.
And Nehemiah is a great example of why you shouldn't feel like I'm being selfish. Look at Nehemiah 5, and we don't have a lot of detail to talk, but verses 14 through 19, Nehemiah is telling God, I did not, all these 12 years I've been here as governor, I didn't take any of the governor's food. The portion that would be for the governor. In fact, he took that and shared it. I think about 150 of the Jews. He never took anything that was his portion. So what does he say in verse 19? Remember unto me, O God, for good all that I've done for this people. Was that selfish? It's a fact, isn't it? But he said, God, remember me for good. And we need to get over the idea I'll just be thinking of others. But the point is, I want to be remembered for good, and there's nothing sinister about that. There's just certain people in life, they don't care about themselves. They'll work themselves to death for somebody else. There's people like that. And you marvel at them. And here Nehemiah is doing things for people, but he wants to be remembered by God. That's a private thing. between him and God. But he writes these things. This is what I've done, and that's what God knows that. Why are you praying to God for that? That seems kind of selfish. No, I think this is instructive to your point. That and we've got to get out of that mode. God, I need this type of help, and if it's be your will, thank you. If it be your will, I'd like to live and see my family raised and so forth, and that sort of thing. And because if you don't ask, you won't receive. Any other comments about that? Yes, Jenny? Yeah. Well, good. And he can't give up on doing that, because it will come true in 5 years sometimes. Question 7, I know we'll just get through this as much as we can. What did Nehemiah request from King Artaxerxes I that were needed to start rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem? He needed timber, didn't he? So he's going to the king's timber country. The guy is over the charge of that. I want to have all that. And he just keeps adding to the list of all the things that he needs. And he gets it. Question 8, what signs of a good leader were manifested by Nehemiah when he arrived in Jerusalem? We talked a little bit about what he did. South part of the town. As a good leader, he didn't tell everybody what we're going to do. He looked at the problem first, didn't he? Then he had in his mind what he's going to do, and he got busy of getting them to work. What signs of a good governor were manifested by Nehemiah when famine and selfishness caused problems among the people? You go to Nehemiah in the 5th chapter, and as time went on, the rich people were getting richer and the poor were getting neglected. They were having to put themselves in debt to provide for their own food. And Nehemiah said, they were bought out of Egyptian bondage, and now they're our slaves? It's not right, brethren. And even he want to make sure that they forgave their debts. They had to change it. That's a governor. That's one meeting the needs. And you see in our political system, what are governors on the borders doing? They're getting busy doing that, and who are they grabbing about? Federal government, not doing their job. And that's a good governor. And the way they take a lead, it's not an easy route to go, but they care about the people. How did Nehemiah strengthen the hands of the people for the difficult good work ahead of them? Let's just rise up and build. We can do this. And of course, he had God behind that. What barriers did Nehemiah and the people rise above in the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem? They had to go through a lot of them, but like my rulers aren't working. They had a mind to work. We see in Nehemiah 4, and they overcame that. What happened when these enemies, Sanballat in particular, and Tobiah, and those people who were Arabs, people from all the areas around, maybe they were type of Arabs, not necessarily from Edom, but Arabs that were coming through that would plunder cities and no walls established here. They were enemies. How did they try to break the people? And I wish we had time just to go through it, but if you were a Persian king, Artaxerxes I, Persian kings did not like you to rebuild the walls of your city. Why? Because you're still subject to us. And so what did these men do? Of course, Artaxerxes sent him for that job, but these men, are you enemies of the king? They're not going to like this. We find one place where the people were coming in from the areas, and 10 times they say, come back and join us, and don't be involved in this work. And we also see that they were ready to do work that, while the people are doing that, they'll come and fight them. It doesn't say that they did, but I think we see a point that they were trying to. What did Nehemiah do about that? They armed them. The guys carrying the burdens would have a sword by their side, but they would have guys with spears, and they would put them up there. But what's interesting, they put some guys, and they put them in a low place. Why would you put men who could fight in a low place? Well, that's easy access to the city. Not a high place. They come on in. and they put them in an open place. Why? Because it's a deterrent. You're going to have to fight. We're going to fight if you're going to take us. And apparently it worked. They went back and they got upset because they found their plan, and he overcame all of those barriers. And there were so many barriers. I mean, after this, you got people intermarrying, you got people violating the Sabbath. Nebuchadnezzar goes home and he comes back and he finds this sort of thing. People of God have got to consistently be taught. And you have to just keep working, because things rise up, and who's the cause of that? Who wants that to disrupt? Who wants that to have conflict and defeat God? It's the devil. And Satan gets in and gets us through complications. I want to sum up. Question 14. Through what three means did God's providence? So we're not looking at miracles taking place here. We're talking about a hard work, talking about prayer and work, but what God's providence, that's how he answers prayers, through providence. What three means did God's providence work in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem under the governorship of Nehemiah? And I think this sums it up pretty well. Look at the backside. Would you agree with this? Prayer, persistence, and what's the third one? Adaptability. How did they adapt? We know he prayed and asking God for his guidance, all of that. So prayer, talking to God, and then they had a mind to work. They overcome the difficulty. They built the wall halfway up, and then they completed it. And they were persistent. They had a mind to work, and they're going to keep working. Even Nebuchadnezzar, after the plan of sabotaging them with fighting and soldiering and so forth with soldiers, when that didn't work, they said, Nehemiah, meet us down here. Come to this place. We'll all meet together and talk about it. He said, I got work to do. Can't do it. But he knew they were going to kill him. And then others said, let's go inside the temple walls, inside the temple, and shut the doors, and we'll be protected. He said, I'm not going to hide in the temple. So he had overcome a lot of barriers there himself, but he adapted. He adapted. That's man using his wisdom. Maybe he got it from God, an answer to prayer, but prayer, persistence, and adaptability. Be flexible. You've got events that take place in God's kingdom today, and you have to have leaders that are flexible and deal with the issues. Okay. Anything you want to add to that before we go to our next stage? Okay. Thank you.
We are VBS to say goodbye. We are VBS to say goodbye. The treasures that were taught from the Bible they were taught. We are VBS to say goodbye.
Goodbye until tomorrow.